Hi, welcome to Stand With Us Connect. I'm Roz Rothstein, your host today, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Stand With Us. So we're very excited to be here today. Our topic is Jewish refugees from Arab countries, and we are joined by all of you from all over the world, literally. And Stand With Us has been on the forefront of Israel education, and it's no different during this pandemic. So we have created this new platform, Stand With Us Connect. We want you to check it frequently, like every day. Check it every day, because we always have new programs that we put on the website, and we will be offering all kinds of great dynamic shows. And not only that, but if you miss one, they're all up there so that you can watch them. So Stand With Us can also offer you an opportunity to develop your own Stand With Us Connect webinar. So we can tailor make something for your organization. So contact us and we will help you with that. Today we have Rachel Wahba with us, who's going to be the symbol of Jewish refugees for us and tell us her family's journey, which is incredible, and I can't wait for you to hear it. But before we introduce her, I just want to say that Stand With Us loves Israel, and we know that that you love Israel. So basically we have a fantastic bond. And if you love our programming, please don't forget to support our efforts. And by the way, this Thursday is May 21st. Why do we care about that? Because Stand With Us is turning 19 years old this Thursday. And so we're going to celebrate. We'll celebrate online at 5 o'clock Pacific Coast time. And if you check Stand With Us Connect, you'll see more details about that. So, okay, now Rachel, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you with us. Rachel Wahba, a little bit about Rachel. She lives in San Francisco Bay Area, and she's a writer, psychotherapist, and co-founder of Olivia Travel. She also sits on the board of Jemena, Jews Indigenous to the Middle East and North Africa, an organization dedicated to the education and advocacy of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewish heritage. And there's a reason this means a lot to you. And the reason it means a lot to you is because you are a Jew with Egyptian and Iraqi parents. And so that is those are your roots. So let's start from the beginning, Rachel Wahba, which is an interesting last name, and we'll be talking about that later. But first, where were you born?
I was born in Bombay, India, now Mumbai, to an Iraqi Jewish mother and an Egyptian Jewish father. Who left their countries, their very deeply rooted communities, because of increasing anti-Semitism at different times.
So that's a big story, and what an interesting thing that you were born in India, but we'll get back to that a little bit later. And I know that your family was stateless for 20 years. We'll also get back to that, but it was all a result of this exodus of the Jews from Arab countries. So let's start with your father's story. Tell us about your father in Egypt.
Okay. So obviously I didn't know my father in Egypt, but I had my father with me for a long time. And he told me many, many, many stories, and the history of his life and the history of his parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. So in the short amount of time we have, my father grew up in a town called Mansoura, and there was a Jewish community there, as there were, but his family originally came from Mustai. And interestingly enough, we found this book when I was with my dad in France, and it's called Juifs d'Egypte, Jews of Egypt. It was published in the 80s. It is no longer in print, but you can find it online. Everything in this book is online. And so Juifs d'Egypte. And looking through, my father annotated this whole book. And we found relatives in there. And one that was very meaningful to us is a peasant woman in Mustai many, many hundreds of years ago, married to a Wahba, married to a Gabriel Wahba, and she's barefooted and she's in the fields. And that is our origins. We were farmers in Egypt before moving to the cities and becoming businessmen or, all kinds of positions. But originally our Jews, our Wahba family grew up as peasants, owning land, having that land stolen, no recourse, stolen by a Muslim, no recourse. So there's a big story in terms of how he grew up, always knowing that at any minute, a Jew could be brought up on false charges. There could be a riot somewhere. In his childhood, there were riots in Mansoura, in Port Said, in Tanta, in, not sure about Cairo, but there were a lot of riots going on in the 20s. And then
riots against Jews.
Riots against Jews. Jews were never safe, even in the best times.
So your father's history in Egypt, I wanted to just underscore something you told us earlier, which was that your family had literally been in Egypt for thousands of years. Is that right?
Yes. I always would say, well, how long? How long? He says, father's side, forever. Forever, as far as back as anybody could think of. They lived in mud huts. They lived, forever. And at one point, there was a village that was so full of Jewish Wahbas that it was known to the locals as Kfar Wahba, village Wahba. We were Felahin, like the rest of them. We were the same, except we were Jews. And so we were infidels. And so when we got respect, we were thrilled. I mean, my father, to say it was Kfar Wahba, it was this great honor. He had a great-great-great-grandfather who they called him Sheikh, a Jew to be honored. So this was for them to honor a Jew, for the Muslims to honor the infidel was a very big deal. And my father felt that the Wahbas were a very respected family.
So you're describing sort of the mix of your father's storytelling to you. Can you give us a little bit of the sense of the mix? So it was a nice experience sometimes and it was difficult other times. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
He was happy in Egypt. He had his family, he had his friends, Jewish friends. He had friends in school who were Jews and non-Jews, but mostly they did not have Muslim friends. He went to a cosmopolitan Catholic school in Mansoura. So he was exposed to a lot of other cultures, but at the same time, always knew at any point a Jew could be a target. Let's say he's bullied playing marbles by a non-Jew. If he was playing marbles with a non-Jew, there was no recourse. A parent couldn't go and say, hey, your children are, bullying my child.
So they had to basically accept any kind of mini or maximum kind of violence. There was no recourse. Legally, there was no recourse. Are we talking about second-class citizenship?
We are talking about second-class citizenship, and we're talking about during the Ottoman Empire, laws were actually in place to put Jews in their place. During colonization, Jews did better because these laws were not enforceable. But we are talking about over 1,000 years of hatred for Jews. So that was always underlying any transaction.
Mm-hmm.
It was always precarious. Jews didn't feel safe, not in Egypt, not in my mother's Iraq, not anywhere in the region.
So slowly, as your father was growing up, at some point, he decided that he was going to leave, even before the mass exodus. Can you bring that story to light?
Yes. He originally wanted to leave when he graduated high school. He was in the Zionist circle. He was a young Zionist. He wanted to be a pioneer in British Mandate Palestine. For whatever reason, at the time, he personally could have been able to do it. There was no entry. There was no way for him to get into British Palestine. Jews were not being let in. I think there were underground movements, but he wasn't a part of that for some reason. I'm not sure why. I think it might be because he had to go to work. It was the Depression. His father had lost his drugstore in Mansoura. Dad had to go to Cairo and work in a Jewish department store. And Cairo had a lot of rich Jews, and they were very well placed. But most Jews in Egypt and everywhere else in the region were mostly not rich. So Dad went to work as an inventory clerk in Ben Zion department store, which was a very famous department store. And he worked there for 2 years or so as an inventory clerk. And during that time, he started seeing the popularization of Mein Kampf. And when he saw it being translated into Arabic and being a bestseller in Cairo's bookstores, he said, he told me, I saw the writing on the wall. There was no future for Jews in Egypt. And also in 1938, riots had started against the Jews. So that, in combination with an underlying, underbelly of hatred for the Jews in Islam, it was time to go.
So your father left before the rest of his family left. He saw the future, and he came to his father and he asked for permission to leave. Is that right?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Because he was, he was working to support his father and support the younger brothers. And he wasn't sure, if it would be okay for him to leave. And also, I'm sure he was very attached to Egypt. My father was, paradoxically, a very proud Egyptian and a very intensely connected Jew. So he went to his father, and because his leaving was made possible because he had an older brother who was sort of a renegade adventurer. Yaqub had gone to the Far East and started a business in Japan and China. And he invited my father to join him. And my father asked his father, should I? What do you think? And his father said, yeah, absolutely, go. Because he was seeing the riots. I mean, my grandfather grew up with the riots in the 20s. He knew about the riots before that, and now he's seeing more riots and the rise of Nazi propaganda that is meshing with the Islamic experience of the Jew as a dirty infidel. Mm-hmm. So that combination for my dad made it time to leave, and his dad saw that too.
So then his father gave him something very, very special. Tell us about that.
So he gave him his blessing, and the blessings actually concretized in this talit. This talit was originally a very, very big talit from his father. So my father's father used it to pray with, but it was handed down to him from his father. It was very precious. And it was a very big talit. And what he did was he had somebody cut it in half, add the necessary tzitzit to it, gave it to my father and said, Musa, this is for you, and take the other one to Yaqub. And when my dad died, right before he died, he told me to go to the Tansu and get the talit, and that it was mine.
Okay, can you explain Tansu?
Tansu is a Japanese dresser.
Oh.
Which, we ended up in Japan, and then from Japan, when they came to the US, they brought this one Tansu. and it had a special place in there.
Uh-huh. A dresser, not a person, like a box.
At the time, it was like a big dress.
A box, yeah. I want to point out that we have this this little booklet here. I'll hold it up. Jewish Refugees from the Middle East. It's a booklet you can access at standwithus.com under resources. And inside we have a listing of the populations in the late 1940s. And here I see Egypt in the 40s had 75,000 Jews. So we're talking about your father leaving early, and what a story, and you know, Mein Kampf and all the signs and the writing on the wall, as you say. And now there are barely any Jews, unfortunately, in Egypt, but you know, they were afraid for their lives.
Well, yeah, they had to go. And they were given, the rest of my family, except for one or two relatives, stayed behind. Those relatives had a very unhappy ending. One Wahba stayed to take care of his synagogue and his aging mother. And he was beaten to death outside the synagogue one day in the 50s. And the others, a nephew-in-law, stayed behind, and his niece stayed behind, and in 67, the husband, like any other Jews that were still in Egypt in 67, were put in concentration camps. They eventually got out, this relative, and moved to Israel, and he didn't live long after the concentration camp experience.
Yeah, it was horrific, and I invite people to learn more about this, the issue and life in Egypt for Jews. It's very important because we're talking about an exodus from Arab countries of over 750,000 Jews. The number is closer to 850,000 Jews. So it's really important for a collective Jewish community to tell this story. And so we deeply appreciate you telling your family's journey. Let's talk about Iraq and your mother and your grandmother, and then we'll see how your mother met your father. But let's start with Granny. How do we start this story?
Okay, I think we can start with Mom and then go to Granny. Granny's a very colorful character. But first, Egypt. Can I go back to how, you know, my father had left, his brother Yaqub had left, couple stayed behind into this, well, one died and the other was put in a camp in the 60s. But this was a very large clan that we had of the Wahbas. And by the way, Wahba is an Egyptian name. It's a generically Egyptian name. It means gift of Allah's gift. And Jews, Christians, and Muslims all hold this name. And it's just an Egyptian name. So we were very, very, very rooted. And his entire family, his 6 brothers, his father, were all given laissez-passer, one way out, and do not come back, with 1 suitcase of clothing, no money, no jewelry, nothing, to join the some 650,000 Jews from Arab lands into Israel.
Yes, even more, even more. The numbers are never going to be exact, but we're looking at 850,000 Jews from Arab countries. Okay, your mother.
My mother, again, she was a proud Iraqi. She knew nothing but being Iraqi. She's a Jew, of course, educated in a Catholic school. Many Jews were educated at the time in the 30s and 40s by the French. So there were French Catholic schools and there were the French Jewish schools. And my mother, for whatever reason, chose the Catholic school. Her siblings went to the Alliance Française Israélite, which was the Jewish Catholic schools. They studied in French and Arabic. Arabic was the primary language. And my mother loved it there, despite having a horrendous experience coming home from school, she said, I never knew what was going to greet me around the corner. We're talking alleys, right? In Baghdad, these are alleys. And she said, around the alley, who would be there? Would there be a boy to pull my dress, you know, my blouse down? Would there be somebody calling me a whore? Would they be laughing, taunting, whatnot? So for her, there was that. But at the same time, she said she adjusted to it. And in terms of my mom, you know, she was an Iraqi Jew. She was an Iraqi Jew like all her relatives. Again, large families. Again, you know, tracing their time there to biblical times, 3,000 years.
Wow.
And knowing no other country. And it was insular. And they didn't travel around except maybe a man would go to a different country, you know, like to make his fortune and whatever, eventually bring over the family. But that, for the most part, the Jews stayed where they were born.
Amazing. So it kind of was dangerous. You're describing damning a child being afraid to walk home from school. That's a dangerous feeling, like you're never going to feel safe. And I know you said that your mother lived her life with that anxiety, that never feeling safe. What about your grandmother, her mother?
Well, her mother grew up in Singapore, very privileged, of an Iraqi family that had left Iraq in the 1800s and then went to India, and from India went to Singapore. He became a very successful copra dealer, making oil out of coconuts in Malaysia. And Granny was educated in, you know, she spoke English. She thought she was British. I mean, she was a British subject, but she really embraced it, loved the king, the queen. She played the piano, she cut her hair, she wore Western dresses. Granny was a
In
free
Singapore.
Singapore.
In
She
Singapore.
was a
Yeah.
free woman. Oh, I'm going to show you a picture of Granny in Singapore. Forgot to show you all these pictures.
That's okay. We'll go back. But first, let's see Granny.
Yeah, sorry. Granny in Singapore. So
A modern woman of the time. A modern woman.
And she moves to a Baghdad where some of the women, her mother-in-law, was still veiled. And I mean, at that time, Jews were not veiling anymore. Middle-class Jews weren't veiling for the most part. But I mean, the poor Jews were still veiling. But Granny got there and she had the shock of her life. And her shock of her life was to see Jews. Now, the Jews she grew up with, you know, Singapore, they had 2 synagogues. They had a Jewish community. They interacted with the British. They held parties. They did not just relate family members to family members. She goes to Baghdad. And number one, she's considered an outsider because she wasn't born and raised in Iraq. She didn't even speak Arabic at the time. She learned to. She was young enough. She was only 16. Oh, we didn't even talk about how she got to Iraq.
She's 16 when she married her husband, whose family was in Iraq. So the reason she ends up in Iraq is because she gets married to a man whose entire family is in Iraq. Okay, so now she's in Iraq and she's in shock.
She's in utter shock. And she tells everybody she's in shock. And they tell her, get used to it. This is how it is here. Maybe it was like that for you, learning the foxtrot and the waltz and doing whatever you're doing in Baghdad, and take that lipstick off. And what are you doing with that short hair? Get with the program. And she said no.
So she walked around with short hair?
Yeah, she walked around with short hair and lipstick and Western clothes. And they screamed at her on the streets, not the Jews. The Muslims on the street, the men would scream at her, gahba, you know, whore. And they would say things to her like, you know, and then she'd yell back in English. And then they thought, wow, maybe she's British, whatever. But they always knew she was a Jew. I don't know how you know these things in these countries, but they all know who's the Jew, who's the Muslim, who's the Christian. They all looked the same, speak the language, maybe a little bit different idiomatically, but everybody knew who everybody was in these countries.
So she was liberated, and she was feisty. She was called names, and she yet was able to somehow survive for, you told me, 15 years, right?
15 years.
years when she had your mother in Iraq. So tell us more about how she survived and how she had your mom and how that all fit together.
Well, she cried the whole time that she wanted to go back to Singapore. And, but that wasn't possible because she wouldn't be able to take her children to Singapore. So she wasn't going without her children. And my mother never wanted to leave Iraq. So they had their conflict there. But she survived by being angry, by speaking back, by never giving in until this next story. So Granny started making friends with non-Jews. Primarily, she had a very, very close friend who was the wife of a Syrian doctor. And I don't know how she met them, but she met them and they spoke English. So Granny was always gravitating. Anybody speaking English, she wanted to be friends with them. So they spoke English. They thought, wow, what kind of a Jew is this? This is not our usual Jew. And they started inviting her to their parties. And she said, oh, they loved me so much because I wasn't like other Jews. I wasn't like a mouse. I spoke up. I wanted freedom. They were free. They were all in Western dress. They weren't veiled. They were very modernized Syrians and Iraqis. And so she went to a dinner party. This must have been around 1940. Unbeknownst to her, the guest of honor was Hajj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. So this guy gets up at the party and he gives a speech. And the speech is all about how Hitler is coming. Hitler is going to help Iraq and the rest of the entire region get rid of all its Jews. It's filthy Jews. I mean, the man was an anti-Semite way before the Zionist enterprise in Palestine. So the guy was just a hateful human being. And Granny sat there listening, but the shock was not just that they hosted him, because maybe that could have been a mistake, they clapped.
Her friends clapped.
Friends clapped. And when I spoke with Granny about this so many years later, she said, you know, I thought only the hooligans on the street calling us whores and telling us they were going to rape us and telling us all these horrible things and putting, you know, filling our jars from the store with piss and throwing snakes at us on the way home. I thought that was just basically the low life. But here was the elite. And she went home, and that was a very
turning point.
It was a turning point. And then shortly thereafter, there was the Farhud. And that was.
Okay. So let us move a little bit into the Farhud, which a lot of people don't know about. So please tell us that story and how your family survived the Farhud.
So the Farhud took place June 1 and 2 in 1941. And it came on very suddenly, and Jews were getting very ready. They were getting ready for Shavuot, doing their shopping and whatever. And then news came that some guys were taken off a bus and run over, not once, but twice. And there was a commotion going on saying, Jews, go home, get to your homes. So my mother lived in the outskirts of, in Baghdad, in a suburb, a mixed suburb, and most of the Jews lived in the Jewish quarter, which is where the riots started. So they're going home, thinking they're going to be safe at home, and all of a sudden, marauders come in, and they're screaming, and they have knives, and they just overrun the Jewish quarter for 48 hours. Now, this 48 hours is very important. The British could have come in 5 minutes and stopped it, but they allowed it to go on for 48 hours because the Arabs were furious that the pro-Nazi government in Iraq had been overthrown by the British, and they were furious at the British, so they're going to take it out on the Jews, and that was fine with the British for 48 hours. But before they stopped it, at least 3,000 businesses were destroyed, 2,000 injured. We don't know how many were killed, 300, we don't know. We don't know these numbers because people were afraid to come forth.
I spoke with Edwin Black, who actually wrote a book about the Farhud, and he said, we will never know. We will never know how many people were murdered, raped, pillaged, because when they started giving testimony, it was clear that they were at risk. So once you shut up a few people, you intimidate a few people, everybody else goes silent. So the real story of the Farhud will never be known. But we know it was a pogrom, and it was very violent. And your mother lived through it, and your grandmother lived through it. And that was a final straw for your grandmother?
That was the final straw for my grandmother. And that was the first time my mother agreed with her that it was time to get out of Baghdad. Mm. And, you know, her husband was already in India, my grandmother's husband. He was sent to India like a year before the Farhud because Granny was making so much trouble, according to the family, and speaking up on the streets and consorting with what the family thought were dangerous people. And they thought, you know what, we cannot keep Matsuda here. You've got to leave and make a home for her outside of here because she's going to get us all killed. So he was already in Bombay, where, you know, there was a nephew, you know, the Jewish trade route, you know, you have a nephew here and another nephew there and an uncle there, and you go and you join them in business when you can.
So he was paving the way. He was paving the way for the family to come.
Correct. And so after the Farhud, she said, I'm not waiting another minute. And she had a British passport, Granny did. And so she went to the authorities. She went to the Iraqis and they said, yeah, you have a British passport, fine. You can leave, but you can't take your kids, they're Iraqi. And she said, they're my children, I'm not leaving without them. It took her 2 years, a bureaucratic nightmare, to get out. And the British weren't helping because the British, from what I've read, the British wanted the Jews to stay in Iraq because they saw them as a stabilizing force. So they weren't ready to let all the Jews of British passports or let the Jews out. They probably could have let the Jews out. They were in power. So Granny said it took about 2 years.
2 years to get out after the Farhud.
2 years
after the Farhud. Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Now you mentioned that your mother always lived in fear because of this Farhud. Do you want to elaborate how she wore her shoes, etc.?
Yes, yes. My mother, I grew up hearing about the Farhud because I also grew up in a Jewish community in Japan where several families had lived through the Farhud. Some couldn't talk about it and others talked about it a lot. So my mother, you know, in Iraq you have rooftops, and when something's happening you run to the rooftop to see these flat rooftops to see what's going on somewhere else, because suddenly they started hearing screams. It just like screams. And my mother said, the screams, I will never forget the screams. And they were coming closer and closer to her house. And they ran on their rooftop to some relatives further out where there was a man in the house because, you know, grandpa was in Bombay already. So they were without a man, my mother, her mother, and 2 younger siblings. So she said, I slept with my shoes on for 2 weeks afterwards. I watched beggars coming to our house from the Jewish quarter who had lost everything. They went to the Jewish quarter to see what had happened. There was some relative living there. She said it was demolished. She said there literally wasn't a grain of rice left. And when the British said stop it, my mother saw, stop it and return what you took from the Jews. Yeah. So my mother lived by the Tigris, and she remembers seeing sewing machines, appliances, lamps, a piano, whatever could not be used. A lot of the marauders were Bedouins. They had come in for the slaughter. And well, whatever they couldn't use, they threw in the river, and my mother saw it all float by.
Because they couldn't use it because they didn't have electricity.
I think that, yes.
Okay. Before we leave Iraq, before we take your family out of Iraq, which was predictable after the Farhud, let's go back to what you mentioned about being a second-class citizen in Iraq, even before the late 1930s with the coming of the Nazi movement. Can you tell us a little bit about the ditch story and all that the second-class citizenship issue, like you did about Egypt?
Well, yes, the Jews were always second-class citizens all over the region. My mother personally witnessed and unclean, so not just second class, filthy, unclean, disgusting, really. And it's in the culture. It is in the culture. It's in the water. It's just every Muslim is taught that we are an unclean, stubborn, not to be trusted, vile creatures.
Okay. You mean at the time? You mean we're talking about
always
Iraq.
We're talking about after the Muslim conquest. And in Iraq, for example, the dhimmi laws were not in effect because the British were there. During the Ottoman Empire, the dhimmi laws were in effect. In effect, the Jew's head could never be higher than a Muslim's. A Jew's house could never be taller. A synagogue had to be a certain height, way below the mosque. A Jew insulted by a Muslim could not speak back. A Jew ripped off by a Muslim could not speak back. So no recourse. And so this is the climate. And my mother, so even though these laws weren't enforced, if somebody spat at you, you could do nothing about it. If there was a ditch and a Jew's walking and a Muslim's walking, the Jew has to step in that ditch. So his head is not as high as the Muslims. And if there is no room for both of them, the Jew's in the ditch. This is without question. And my mother even witnessed and never forgot when she went to Basra, which is a Shia area, and the Shia are always more religious than Sunni. She went with her father, and they were trading in dates. My grandfather was buying dates from a Muslim seller in Basra, and she watched how after the business transaction was finished, the Muslim said a prayer and washed his hands because he had just done business with a Jew.
I want to point out, Rachel, that in the same booklet, Forgotten Refugees, the Jewish Forgotten Refugees of the Middle East, I'm now looking at the numbers of Jews that used to live in Iraq. In the 1940s, the number was double that of Egypt. 150,000 Jews in Iraq before the mass exodus, and now there are zero. Predictably, if that's the kind of treatment that people were getting and the shoe was always about to fall and you're viewed in this light that you're describing, it's predictable. So now let's go back to your grandmother's leaving, uprooting and going to join.
So they go to India, and India had no anti-Semitism. There were 3,000 Jews in Bombay at the time, 2 synagogues in Bombay, one of which my parents got married in, and I went to visit it with my father about 15 years ago, and there was maybe 30 Jews left in that synagogue, but that they had other Jews, other Indian Jews coming. But the Baghdadian community was very prominent and had a presence in India at the time. We were in film, in the arts. They loved the Baghdadian Jewish girls to act in the movies because, you know, India is very color coded in terms of skin. Baghdadian Jews were lighter skinned than the indigenous Indians. So there were a lot of Iraqi girls and men who were movie stars in those days. India. Ask me a question.
The big question is, how did your mother and father meet?
That question. Okay, so my father had left Japan and Shanghai in right before the war, so 1941. And he got to Bombay. Yaqub was in Bombay, opening an office in Bombay. Time to get out of the Far East because it was very clear Japan was going to go to war with the United States. So Dad got on a last ship out of Shanghai, got to India in 1941. Now remember, the Farhud was in 41, so they're still back there. Dad's in India with my mother's father. They like each other. And then the families, and they do business together, exporting spices, whatnot, from India to the Middle East. And Granny and my mom and her younger sister and brother arrive. My father is immediately smitten with my mother. And his older brother tells him, well, Maurice, you know, you are now ready to go and find a wife. So we need to find you an Egyptian wife. And he says, well, actually, and he stutters and stammers and said, I already found my wife here. And said, what, who? Ephraim's daughter, Katie. And
Who wasn't Egyptian.
Now, Yaqub was fine with that. My mother was like, what do you mean? When her father tells her, you know, you have a suitor and it's Musa, Maurice, and he wants to marry you. And she says, what do you mean? He's Egyptian. How can I marry an Egyptian? Iraqis only married Iraqis. And my grandfather said, he's different. This one's different. So she gets the okay. She's not sure. She said, okay, I need 3 dates. Of course, they're chaperone dates. One to a movie, one for a horse-drawn carriage, and another a long walk. And they talked and talked and talked about everything. All their values, their history, their everything. He was even more in love. He couldn't wait. She said, I'll grow to love him.
And did she?
Did.
Good. Can you show us a picture of your parents?
Yeah, and where is their anniversary picture? This is their anniversary picture. Very good looking people.
Beautiful.
And they got married a month later.
So, fantastic. And you know, the reason they actually met is because of all the circumstances that led up to it and the mass exodus. Eventually, I mean, that they had the foresight to leave Egypt and Iraq so that they would meet. And then there's Rachel and your brother and everything that came after that.
Where's Rachel? Here's Rachel.
Oh, you have a picture of Rachel as a baby? Oh.
Picture of Rachel in India.
A little closer. There you go. A cute little Rachel. Very nice. So we have some questions coming to us from our listeners. I would love to ask you. Are you ready? So Joanne from Germany is asking, you talked about your family being stateless for 20 years. Can you talk about that a little bit? How could such a thing happen?
Well, what happened was okay, so we were in India. Dad left India for Japan again in 1949. And because India had now gotten, this is such a long story. India had gotten independence from the British, tax laws were impossible. My father had to find another place to do business. His brother now, Yakub, had already gone back to Japan. So Dad goes to Japan and to join him in business. My mother and brother, well, my mother and pregnant with my brother are supposed to join him in 1 month. We don't get in. We are already technically stateless because Egypt has now decided not to add any spouses onto the passport of the Egyptian Jew. Long story, but we get out of India eventually 1 year later on Red Cross papers. And we join my father in Japan on Red Cross papers. I am 4.5, and it's after the war. It's 1950. And things were difficult in Japan, but we were there. And my father had a passport that was no longer usable because Egypt started canceling all Jewish passports of Jews that were not in the country, that were outside Egypt. So even though there were still Jews in Egypt in 1950, because his family wasn't kicked out till 1956. So those, theoretically, we should have had an operating passport, but we didn't. Now, in Japan, it was very confusing to the authorities. What do you mean you're stateless? Where were you born? They would come to our house, and one time I watched them interrogate my father. Well, if you're born in Egypt, you're Egyptian. My father finally lost his temper and said, you know what, go ask Nasser.
So needless to say, it was a complicated situation where people leave countries under the worst of circumstances. And I think those countries were not cooperative at all. David from Israel is asking, why didn't your stateless family make Aliyah? Why didn't they go to Israel?
Yeah, you would think that that would have happened. Israel at the time was dirt poor. Israel was having to settle hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over the world, and in some of those hundreds of thousands of Jews were our people, our family from Iraq and from Egypt, and they were living in tent cities and tin shacks for several years. So, and pauperized. In Japan, we were sending them clothes and whatever money, whatever we could. My father was an import-exporter. What was he going to do in the Ma'abarot? You know, what was he going to do in Israel? And my mother would say, what's your father going to do there? My father was such a Zionist, he probably would have gone because his family was there, everyone was there, this was his dream. But my mother was like, no, no, no. Not only did I experience the Farhud, I am not going to be in a tent for a whole bunch of years and never know that we're ever going to survive. And
Amazing. So it was a financial decision that they were afraid to go live in a tent.
well, we had no money. What were we going to do there? And so they actually had applied for immigration to the United States already in India in 1947. And so every year in Japan, we thought, this year we're going to get our visa to America. This year we're going to get our visa. Did the visa come? When are we going? And I was learning English. I was preparing. I read every magazine, anything I could get a hold of in English. You know, my first accent was I spoke English, British English with an Indian accent. So I listened and prepared myself. Me and my brother, we were coming to America. And we did after 20 years.
So the consequences of the Jewish exodus were heavy for so many people. Many didn't have choices and they weren't in Japan, so they were living in tents until Israel could settle them. Such a fascinating story, and you are such an amazing symbol of the Mizrahi Jewish story. And you've told it so well. So all of us really appreciate that you joined us today to tell this important story. There's films about it. There's The Forgotten Refugee. People should see that film. It's a Jimena production, right? And it's a wonderful film, and it really gives you insight into these forgotten cultures of hundreds, if not thousands of years of Jewish cultures in Arab countries. It's just, it's very, very sad. 0 Jews in Iraq now. It just tells you the story right there. So Rachel, thank you. And for a moment, I just want to tell everybody that this time next week, 11 o'clock in Pacific Standard Time, and you'll find all the times at Stand With Us Connect. We have an upcoming show that you'll not want to miss about Olga Mishwe, Washington, who is a fantastic lover of Israel and activist in South Africa, who actually, oh my goodness, she is at ground zero of the BDS fight. So you're gonna not wanna miss that. And also, once again, I wanna invite you to May the 21st. We're celebrating right here online, and we want you to join us on Facebook and all kinds of places from wherever you are, all around the world, just like you're here with us right now. Thousands of you right now. We want you to join us Thursday to celebrate our 19-year anniversary at Stand With Us. Don't forget, we can customize, we can tailor-make a fantastic webinar for your institution, a church, a synagogue, high school, college campus, whatever you need. Please contact us. Stand With Us. We'll be there for you. Thank you for joining us today. We love you. Bye.